Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ellen Perot, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Work. And I'm so glad you're making the time to join us for this important discussion. Defund the police? What now? I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're broadcasting from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. Before we get started, I want to remind you that today's program is one of more than 25 virtual programs being held throughout September for Alumni Month. In celebration of our 190,000 strong University of Calgary alumni community, we've curated an exciting selection of programs featuring alumni who will inspire you, conversations that will inform you, and expertise that will guide you. I encourage everyone to check out the entire Alumni Month scheduled at alumni.ucalgary.ca. Now back to today's program. Today, we'll explore what people really mean when they say defund the police. We'll also examine how a rethinking of this issue might lead to better outcomes for society, for individuals in crisis, and for the police officers who are asked to intervene in difficult, complex, and often dangerous situations. This panel brings together experts from the faculties and professions of law and social work to consider what a different approach to policing might look like, and how a reimagined police force could lead to better outcomes and help end systemic racism in policing and in the justice system. As the Dean of Social Work, I'm pleased to be the moderator of today's discussion. It's important for us to be able to have honest conversations about social justice and access to justice. The issues that lie at the heart of today's question: defund the police? What next? As a profession, social work and social workers will play an important role in reimagining approaches to dealing with family and mental health crisis in the future. Similarly, our colleagues in law and law enforcement are focused on being part of the conversation as we look to end systemic racism in the justice system, in policing, in ensuring everyone has access to justice. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dave Est is a Faculty of Social Work professor and one of Canada's most respected scholars in the field of anti-Black racism. He has written and edited several books on the subject. He's also recently co-produced a Governor General award-winning documentary on the history of Black settlers in Alberta. Regine Owibureyeho King is a professor in social work whose research interests include social processes of healing, forgiveness and reconciliation, refugee issues, cross-cultural mental health interventions, and Indigenous knowledges. She's currently completing a research project focusing on the mental health equity of Black Canadians. Mark Neufeld is the Chief Constable of the Calgary Police Service. He has been with CPS since 2019 and began his career in policing in 1992. During his decorated career, he has held numerous leadership roles with forces in Vancouver, Edmonton, and most recently Camrose. He holds a master's in criminology and police management from the University of Cambridge. Lisa Silver is a UCalgary alumni and professor in the Faculty of Law and a member of the bars of Ontario and Alberta. She's appeared in all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. She writes and researches in an intensive range of topics, including sentencing, judicial decision-making, and the admissibility of expert and digital evidence. She's also served on the Calgary Police Commission from 2012 to 2018, most recently as vice chair. So here's how today's presentation will run. To get the conversation started, we're going to ask our panelists a few questions that get to the heart of the topic. Then, because we've got so many of our alumni, community, and friends online with us today, we'll use the rest of our time to answer and discuss your questions. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen there, the Q&A box. We appreciate all questions, but please be advised that due to our limited time, we may not be able to answer all of them. A recording of today's program will be available on the Alumni Month website by the end of the week. So let's get started with our first question. Dave, Dr. Est, we'll begin with you. Question one. I'm sure many people get nervous when they talk about defunding the police. What does this really mean? What does this look like in your view?
So thank you for that critical first question. And the term defunding really came into vogue after the killing of George Floyd, I believe in June. And naturally, people were asking the question, well, what is this process or concept of defunding the police? And initially it caused considerable confusion, and the confusion might still exist because some people, when they hear the term, they interpret it that the police services are going to lose their entire budget, which is not my interpretation of defunding the police. My view of defunding the police is that monies are allocated from the police budget and directed into an array of social services and healthcare services, and primarily preventative services that will decrease the public's interaction with the police service. Because from my perspective, police officers are doing more than policing on a daily basis. In fact, they're put in situations where I think that they wish they had the skills of a social worker or a psychologist, because they deal with individuals who are suffering an array of different mental health concerns, mental illnesses. And I've given a lot of thought about defunding the police, and I've had a long-standing interest in the relationship between police services and communities of African descent, because I'm third generation and I've lived in Halifax, Toronto, Montreal, and now Calgary. I've also lived in Edmonton, and they all have relatively large Black populations. And one of the contentious issues in each of those cities has been the relationship between the police service and the Black community, however one defines Black community. The final thing I want to say about this concept and process of panacea is that I think people need to be careful and not to think that this is the panacea that's going to solve everything, because some of the issues that exist between the police and the Black community are longstanding, and I would maintain that in order to deal with these issues, that one's going to have to engage in multiple interventions before we'll see any substantive difference between the relationship of Black people and different police forces across Canada.
My name is Regine King, and I have been asked to respond to this question as well. I agree with Dave that when people hear the terms defund the police, they think it just came out of nowhere. But groups of activists and academics, particularly in the US, have been asking for change in the practices of the police. And they have been tired and discussed by the reforms that have been suggested, that it's not the cameras that resolve the issues that exist between the police and Black people, whether that is in the US or in Canada. Of course, in Canada, when we hear defund the police, the idea is for us to separate ourselves from United States, that we are not like them. Actually, that nothing like that ever happens here. It doesn't exist here in Canada. Of course, I find that to be very cynical because even when we start having a protest here in Canada, we heard so many police chiefs denying that there is no systemic racism in Canada. There is no systemic racism in the police force. Of course, I think when we dig deeper, we realize that the relationships that exist between maybe mainstream Canadians and the police is completely different from the experiences of Black Canadians. So in the question, there was an idea of the panic. Definitely, the panic of hearing defund the police in Canada doesn't come from many Black people. For Black men, their fear, their panic is hearing the siren of the police car behind them, is coming across a guy in uniform, and fear that they may be stopped. They may be asked for IDs, that if they ask why their rights are being violated, they may even be thrown in jail. They may just be fearing for their death. So that's kind of different panic when we hear Black families who need protection of the police, because whether we want it or not, we need the protection of the police. But in Black families, that protection is not actually a given. We hear many families who resolve to never contact the police because they know the outcome of police coming to their house may be more dangerous than handling things in their own ways. So if the police system that we are talking about here is some kind of broken in the ways it handles a certain portion of the population, why can then the increasing funding of the police be allocated to alternative measures that have proven to work? I think that's the question of those who are going beyond the defund the police terms may be thinking of. Of course, when we have a chance, maybe we talk about the numbers, but I wanted to draw the audience of the Globe and Mail analysis of August 30th that demonstrated how the funds that go to the police have been increasing at a faster rate than spending for other services. So these are questions we need to be asking rather than focusing so much on the alarming defund the police. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Just want to say thanks for this great initiative, the panel discussions, and thank you for allowing me to participate. It's clear, obviously, in the public discourse that various individuals and entities have different opinions about what defunding the police means. For some, it's about divesting resources from the police and reallocating them to non-policing forms of public safety and community support, as we heard. Those include social services and youth supports and housing, education, all very important things, as we've heard. For others, it's about abolishing the police in favor of as yet undefined new model of public safety. The discussions around the defund slogan have become divisive in our communities, as the model of policing in Calgary has historically been one that's been quite progressive and also very community oriented. While we've seen many cities in the US come under civil actions and consent decrees as a means of imposing additional citizen oversight and forcing change, we've not experienced those same serious abuses, or at least not to the same degree here in our country. That's not to say that the issues don't exist, of course they do, but as I say, we haven't seen the consent decrees and some of the issues that we've seen there. Many of the structures and the sort of quote unquote law enforcement reforms that are being proposed in the US are really things that have been in place in Canada for some time. I think that should be noticeable. And so while some American cities seem to be, prepared to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, the idea isn't necessarily resonating with all Canadians in relation to that. There is an appetite to acknowledge what is working well at the present time, and then to identify the necessary reforms we need to look at to ensure that fair and equitable policing can be provided to every citizen in large and diverse cities like Calgary and Toronto and others. The issues of individual and systemic racism are complicated, as we've seen, and they do point to necessary reforms within our institutions. But while there's been a strong focus on policing, of course, when we talk about the institutions and the structures more broadly, the issues aren't unique to policing or any one institution, police included. Recently, I know I've personally sought to decouple the issues of addressing systemic racism from the issue of defunding police. Progressive police services, including ours, have long been discussing the need for better integration and coordination of resources, ministries, and supports in our city so that vulnerable Calgarians and those experiencing crisis can get the right services at the right time where they need them. While we heard and agree with the request of diverse communities to look at other options for crisis response in our city, we don't necessarily agree with the nebulous term defunding, which has been interpreted or received as a criticism or punishment of police for doing a poor job of responding to calls for service that in some ways we didn't ask to become responsible for in the first place. It seems like a bit of the politics of austerity where we end up being the de facto response for other services, including mental health, that have been defunded previously at previous times by previous governments. The tone of the conversations have become a bit of a barrier to meaningful dialogue that was already underway about moving towards, I guess, a law enforcement, public health oriented model, which could reduce some of what I think has become a bit of an over-reliance on police. And I think, Dr. Este, you said it well. I think the police have become involved in many things that really aren't part of the conventional mandate. So in my view, the Canadian policing model is arguably one of the best in the world, and Canadian police officers are among the finest people in the world. This is a very important moment for all of us as a society. We need to be particularly thoughtful about next steps for us and ensure that we're allowing evidence to inform significant decisions moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm last, which gives me the benefit of having heard everyone. And I want to acknowledge what everyone has had to say thus far. I acknowledge that this issue is far larger than that word defund. And I also want to acknowledge that WA doesn't own this conversation. I don't think anybody owns it other than the community and the community in which the police service serves, which includes those racialized and marginalized communities that have been using their voice, and as we give them space to use their voice to explain and have a conversation on why they are using that term defund. And, to me, as a legal professional, I feel that I have a responsibility to talk about justice and injustice and what that means and how we are to strive for justice in a system that is historically and systemically limited access to justice for racialized and marginalized communities. And justice does include policing. And today we're talking about policing in the big sense. I think that you can use the word policing in a broader way. I mean, For some groups, policing can be any state intervention or surveillance in their lives, and I think that has to be recognized. And that includes the child welfare, the health system. So as you can see, it's a big issue. So what it involves, though, is not just how we fund the police, but why. Why are we funding police? And why do we need police? And whether or not there are viable alternatives to what the police is doing at this particular point. And of course, linking that to the fact that there is systemic and real racism in the practices and policies in our justice system. Now, to me, the focus should therefore not be on funding, not funding, where do the funds go, but the focus should be on creating a safe community. And then how do we do that without automatically turning to use of force? And I think that the police service, as Chief Neufeld pointed out, has been looking at that, but it has to be, in my view, community-led. We have to hear what the community feels, how they've been impacted, and not only listen to them, hear them, and then take action. So I see this issue of defunding not as divisive, not as a call to abolish police, but as a call to action, which I think we can all appreciate. If we're all here together, if we're all a community that's diverse, that's inclusive, that's equal, then we have to acknowledge that some groups have not experienced equal justice. And I think that's what this conversation, at least to me, is about.
Thank you all. Terrific answers. Wow, I feel so honored to be here. Dr. Owibieho, would you mind answering the next question to start us off? Question 2 is, do you think the current police and justice system reflects structural racism? Do you think the current police and justice system reflects structural racism?
Yes, but as we are engaging in this discussion, is not just the police or the justice system. Because when I think of the ways the current institutions enact systemic racism, it takes me to a definition that was provided by Jenny Edikins, actually defining a trauma, that it's when these institutions, whether that is the police, the child welfare system, the healthcare system, the immigration system, when all these institutions become torture, that we will seek out help from these institutions because we are looking for protection. But when these structures entrusted to protect us and give us security become our tormentors, when the communities of which we considered ourselves members turns against us, and when our family is no longer a source of refuge, but a site of danger. I think that definition encompasses everything we mean by structural racism, is when you feel like anybody who is out there to provide that sense of protection and safety can be the person turning you in. So the practices of these structures, unfortunately, can also be reflected in interpersonal relationships. For those of us who live in Black bodies, it's very ironic that I go to a grocery store and I try to keep my hands in my pockets. That when the police, actually this is an experience that happens to me, somehow I left the garage door open and the neighbors couldn't reach us, and the police got to be called. When I heard the police knocking at the door, my first instinct was to go hide while they were there to protect me. So that's the things we are talking about here. That when you feel like the person who is supposed to be offering you protection and security becomes a person you need to fear. So systemic racism is out there, is enacted, and we need to be, as we talk about policing and defunding the police, I think we need to be redefining the functions and the operations of those different structures. Whether that is about reallocating the funds, but also I think I need to emphasize something that has already been repeated, that we invest more in prevention, in preventive programs, so that our communities feel safe enough that my neighbors will feel like actually they have that responsibility to protect my home, to call on me, and to ensure that I am safe and anybody else out there is feeling safe when they walk around. So there is research that has shown that there are alternatives. I lived in the city of Winnipeg. There were community patrols that seems to ensure more safety than the police when they stand in the different corners. There are other alternatives that show that actually safe neighborhoods can ensure most of the safety if we really redirect not only our funds, but also redirect our functions and operations. So we need a police that protects all of us, that protects us against organized crime and violence. But as I'm not speaking for every Black person, definitely we don't need the police that criminalize brown bodies and Black bodies instead of protecting everyone. Thank you.
So thank you. In answer to the question, yes, systemic and individual and systemic or structural racism exists in Canadian policing, in all of our institutions, and certainly in our society as a whole. The negative impacts of systemic racism are eroding public trust and confidence in policing. And that's problematic because policing is essential to keeping our communities safe. I think there's a common misperception that systemic racism involves just a few bad apples involved in racist thoughts or actions. And in absence of the important data that would allow us to look larger, as we've talked about, at these issues, I can see where people may understandably think that way. And actually, it's probably uncomfortable at times to think otherwise. But that might explain why we still don't have a broad consensus on the agreement of systemic racism and the existence of it in policing and our criminal justice system. It's for this reason that the CPS has committed to collecting and reporting on the disaggregated race-based data that will help that out. And the language of the conversation, I think, has presented some barriers here as well. The systemic or structural racism, systematic racism, institutional racism, these sorts of things. In Canada, I don't know if we've been comfortable with discussion of it in those terms. I think in Canada, often we're happy to discuss, your ethnicity or your background or your culture, but we tend not to use that word. And I don't know if we're completely comfortable with it. And actually go back just as an experience to when we began to talk about bias, implicit and explicit bias in policing earlier on. And people weren't necessarily comfortable talking about that either initially. And I think there was, over time, there was some acceptance gain that basically the concepts were what the concepts were. And if you were human, certainly you had bias. The challenge, I think, was to acknowledge that you did have them, and then to be able to sort of learn and confront and be open to the fact and even understand how they could manifest there in your life and in your job. And so I guess, as Justice Sinclair said in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have to move past the idea that being part of a systemically racist system means that you yourself are a racist. And we're sort of acknowledging that messaging internally here in the Calgary Police Service. And so acknowledging that our early history and the presence of systemic racism in our profession is not a direct indictment of, the police service or individuals who previously or currently are working within it. But if we don't acknowledge these things, we can't even begin to address them. And so I'd recognize certainly that begins with me, and I've worked a lot to try to understand these issues more deeply, and I want to acknowledge and confront them. And so I think it's the right thing to do. And if leaders don't stand up and do that, then why would anybody else pay attention?
Okay, so I mean, it's a big yes. Of course, I agree that the police, the justice system, I'm part of the justice system, so I acknowledge that there are racist policies and ideas that permeate historically and presently. And I think there's evidence of this. I think what's frustrating, and I actually have a whole list of, you know, here's where you can find racial injustice in the justice system. But what's frustrating is that this is not new. It is not something that is just happening now. It's something that's been around, but it's also something that's been identified before now. And I think that's what's so very frustrating. So, I mean, for instance, the Ontario Human Rights Commission report on racial profiling in the justice system. That's a new report, but it talks about how this is not new. Justice Tulloch in 2018, he's an Ontario Court of Appeal judge. He issued a report on carding or street checks. And I'm going to quote a little bit from that report because it was very good. There's also overrepresentation, multiple reports. I think there's been 14 reports and inquiries over the years on the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. And specifically in our jails in this province, Indigenous offenders make up over 40% of the provincial prison population, yet only about 4% of Alberta's population, I think only 5% nationally. Both federal prisons in Edmonton, the women and the men have well over 50%. So this isn't new. And I think we can talk about how there is evidence, the chief talked about evidence-based, and I think that is important. There's academic articles, not only from panelists that are here today, but also on the law side. And our courts, and I do want to say this, I know that I only have a few minutes, but our courts recently acknowledged systemic, and systemic's a difficult word. I like to use racist policies and ideas, that's clear. But our courts have acknowledged in recent cases, one Regina and Lee, LE, 2019 Supreme Court of Canada, decision written by two Albertan judges, Justice Russ Brown and Justice Sheila Martin, who, Alumni Week, she was Dean of the law school. And she recognized the importance of viewing our legal standards and laws through the lens of racism. And I think that's really important. It's crucial that these acknowledgements are activated by being embedded into what we do, into anti-racist practices and laws. And just finally, and I know again I'm off, but just finally, what the court said in Lee is that simply this, and this was in relation to charter right of not being arbitrarily detained by the police. And in that case, the court said in all neighborhoods and to respect the rights of all people to uphold the rule of law, that the police are to comply with our charter rights and values in order all people are safe and in order to promote public confidence in the police, as the chief said, and to provide safer communities. And so that to me is what's at the heart of all of this issue. I'm done now, thanks.
So I guess it's my turn, and as a Black male growing up and living in Canada and having all my education, there's no doubt that I would have to categorically say that racism exists in all of our institutions, including the police. I'm going to be a bit more specific because racism is a broad term. And as I stated earlier, the relationship between various police forces in Canada and the respective Black communities has been exceedingly problematic. And I like to be positive, and I did read the police services report that they released in September, and that gave me a little bit of glimmer of hope. long before George Floyd was killed in June, there are a number of reports that were done on different police services in Canada. So late 2018, 2019, a criminologist by the name of Scott Wortley did an extensive review of the police service in Halifax. And the particular issue that he addressed was the issue of street checks and carding. And Dr. Wortley's report was quite extensive. And as someone who has lived in Nova Scotia and did research in Nova Scotia, he got paid a lot of money for things most of the people in the audience knew. The one significant outcome, because once again, it's one thing doing these reports, and reports tend to sit on shelves and nobody reads them, and let alone act on them. So the regional police in Halifax did away, at least theoretically, with the practice of street checks or carding, which is quite problematic in terms of people of African descent. In 2018, and once again, I know this police services quite well because the first time I got stopped by the police in Montreal, I was 17 years old, and I was just standing beside my dad's car waiting for him to finish a course. And they stayed beside my side until my dad came out. And that began a cycle of me being stopped in Montreal numerous times. I've been stopped in Calgary numerous times. And once you go through that experience, two things happen. You develop a fear of police and police vehicles, and then there's a fear that something is going to happen to you. So a similar study was done in the Montreal police services, and it was incredulous because the data clearly revealed that Montreal might have the most racist police force in Canada. And the police chief denied it, and that resulted in a claim coming from 9 of his Black police officers who challenged the police, their chief constable's position, and he had a significant turnaround. Lisa talked the overrepresentation of racialized people in the criminal justice system. So as of 2018, the 8.6 of the inmates in federal prisons were people of African descent, but we only represent 3 of the population. And so I think based on what's available, there's certainly ample evidence to make the assertion that anti-Black racism as a form of racism exists in the majority of our police services. And I'll leave it at that because we need to leave time for questions and comments.
Yes, thank you all panelists. That's terrific. I think there's a lot of potential to collaborate, and as a social worker, dean of social work, I think we can potentially have some good collaborations around prevention, that kind of thing. I mean, I think we've got quite a few questions come in. One I think that might really fit for the questions that have been coming in is, what a new approach to policing look like? You know, are Calgary police currently considering any changes? What might a new approach to policing look like? Mark, do you mind taking that one to start us off? And then Lisa and Dave, we'll just keep to a minute if we can.
Okay, thank you, Dean. As I said earlier, I start from the place that Canada has arguably the best policing system in the developed world. Here in Calgary, we dispatch on average about 777 calls every day for service. This doesn't include traffic stops or any officer-initiated interactions that would routinely occur during a workday. Fundamentally, I would say just quickly, there's a couple of drivers, generally speaking. There's the serious crime from the recidivist and high harm offenders that are harming the community that we need to deal with. And that doesn't involve just dealing with them reactively after victimization has occurred. That's actually looking at dealing with it proactively as well and trying to prevent those things from occurring in collaboration with the community. But the other half of it, though, the big driver, relates to the police responding to myriad social issues. So the addictions, the mental health, and the homelessness, the poverty, and that aspect of our work has grown significantly. So I think it's here where there's some opportunities to look at potential alternatives to first response. Policing, as I said, has become the de facto first responder, particularly outside of business hours, which is too bad because it's not like we're in the north or somewhere isolated. In a city like Calgary, we have all the supports. We're blessed to have supports and services available. It's just a matter of the coordination of them and the integration of them in a way that they can do the best good for the most people. We currently have a number of individual plans in the police service to deal with things like disorder. And then running sort of separately from that, we have plans around homelessness in the city. We have mental health and addiction strategy. We have suicide prevention strategies. And yet I think a lot of the people who are coming into the contact with police repeatedly are sort of the same folks that are coming into contact with our EMS and our transit peace officers, and they're in the emergency rooms and that sort of thing. So I think there's a big opportunity to deal proactively with some of the individuals who clearly we know are crossing systems and could use some proactive interventions to help them to get out of the system. Because for a lot of them, certainly a justice response is not what's required. And so to the extent that we keep on operating independently, that's not going to be helpful. Let's face it, the nature of the 21st century society, especially in an urban setting, requires a 24/7 availability of properly trained and equipped police officers in order to respond to emergencies, whether those be human induced or whether they be Mother Nature. And police are currently overtasked to the point that our ability to engage with communities in a positive way in the manner that they ask for is being eroded by the fact that we're responding to so many of these calls. So ultimately, the risk is that that leads to disconnection, weakened relationships and bonds, diminished understanding, obviously, of some of the challenges in the community, less problem solving, and ultimately eroded trust and confidence. So our position is not obviously that the police should be defunded, but rather the role should be better defined, and we should decide in the 21st century environment in 2020 forward, what exactly do we want? What do we feel is the legitimate role for police in our society, and what are the options around that? So again, we're looking at anything that would reduce demand for the police and certainly potentially bring about better outcomes from Calgarians. So I'll stop there. Obviously, I probably went over my time a little bit, and for that I apologize.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, I'm probably going to pose more questions than answers in response to this question of what should a new approach to policing look like. And I am going to remind again of the relationship that the community must have with the police. And again, reference the Telek report, quote, "The worst enemy of effective policing is the absence of public confidence," end quote. And that, quote, "when a segment of society believes that it has been unfairly targeted by the police, it will delegitimize the police in their eyes," end quote. And I think, you know, I'm quoting law and reports, but I think we heard from David and Regine lived experiences that need to be acknowledged. And I thank them for sharing that with us, because that's the root issue. How do we create public confidence and legitimize police in the eyes of racialized communities that are frustrated, that have had enough? And that's why I say, you know, and this is big picture. I know, you know, we need actions, we need real solutions, but big picture is we have to ask ourselves 3 questions. What do we need to create a safe community? And then how do we get there considering equality, diversity, and inclusivity and racial justice are values to drive this change? And then how do we resource it? So it's something, I think Regine mentioned, for instance, these community patrols. Well, in Australia, they've been using Indigenous patrols that are locally run initiatives that are arm's length from the police service there, you know, and that have been quite successful. So there's many different ways that we can look at policing in a different way that starts from a common language and a common desire to do what's right. And I think, by the way, the city has has kickstarted this well by hearing people at the public hearings on policing and racism. And I also, as a former member of the Police Commission, which is supposed to provide independent civilian oversight, I'm happy to see Marilyn North Pegan, who is chairing an anti-racism committee for the commission. She has lived experience. She's a community advocate. She has real knowledge, and so good start, but I like actions. And I think it's, you know, don't give us reports again. Give us real timelines with real solutions.
So I just want to add to what Lisa said. And once again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of being a Black male and a member of Canada's Black or African Canadian. And I was thinking last week, when I was thinking about being on this panel, and so since 2000, 40 Black Canadians have been shot and killed by police officers. And it took me back, so I'm dating myself, because when I started my MSW at the University of Toronto in 1980, there was a spate of killing of young and older Black men. And so so I don't have a vision of a new conceptualization of policing, but I will say this, that in relation to Black communities, that there has to be approaches, mechanisms, I don't know, whatever word you describe, that needs to bring the police and these two communities together, and don't engage in, say, one dialogue or two interactions. It has to be sustained over a period of time, because without the reciprocal education in terms of the police to members of the Black community and vice versa, these communities will never have a strong relationship. And I'm a social worker, so the key to any effective intervention, as someone who's been in social work for many years, is we need, those two entities need to talk to each other over a sustained period of time. And so that's why I would call the process a form of reciprocal education. Because without that, if I live another 20 years, I don't want to be saying, well, when Dave was in his 60s, this was a problem. When Dave was 40, this was a problem. When young David was 20, the same issues, the same challenges still exist.
I echo everything that has been said so far. The one small token I will add is to just re-emphasize that prevention is cheaper. And as communities, we need to be asking ourselves questions about where and how we are investing our monies. I think in addition to being a very beautiful country, we are also a very wealthy country. So we need to be asking ourselves where we spend our monies. And when it comes to the police, since this was for issues about the police and policing, I think, and this speaks even to us as social workers, we need to be asking ourselves how we recruit, how we train, how we select the people who play those roles. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Now, there's been so many questions coming in from the audience, and really good ones, really good ones. As I mentioned at the start, we may not be able to get to all your questions, but we'll fit in as many as we can. I see here, let's start off with pertaining to police reformation. What would be some of the crucial steps that would have to be taken? So, what might be some next steps, folks? Should we start with you, Mark, maybe?
Sure. I think some of the crucial steps, obviously, is, you know, I think going back to talking about what exactly, again, the definition of policing is in the 21st century and what we need to do in that regard. That's a conversation. I think the Police Commission back in probably July had proposed to the government the notion of a summit on the future of policing, because it's a bit of a complex topic. Policing obviously is a provincial responsibility, but at the same time, there's huge inputs and huge involvement at the municipal level and the federal government to the extent that the RCMP or our contract police service. So that there does need to be that discussion at all levels. And right now it's occurring in communities disparately, but at the end of the day, I think it needs to be more focused than that. So given that we're looking at Police Act reform, that seems like a reasonable place to have a conversation about what are the legitimate roles for police at this particular time in that broader lens of community safety and well-being.
Thank you, Mark. There's another question here, a question for Regine. What alternative programs would you suggest integrating to make our communities feel more safe?
What I find very fascinating is that actually when you go in different communities, communities can be very, very creative. But also communities can be kind of dismembered sometimes. When I say they can be very creative, I have seen grassroots programs that are preventive, that work, that keeps the gang activities out, that keep the communities safe. But I have also seen communities where everyone folds his or her arms and wait for the police to do the basics. And I think when we are looking for alternatives, we need to be asking ourselves as citizens, how are we investing in ensuring the safety of our neighborhoods? When it comes to the police, we need to be defining in what circumstances they need to intervene so that they don't end up doing everything. Thank you. I hope I answered the question.
I think so. Thank you. There's so many questions here. There's one here. Much of the discussion on this subject, maybe I'll put this to you, Lisa, is framed around mental health supports or retraining police as a solution, but not typically around building a society that's fundamentally different, where diverse people feel more supported, useful, and valued. The entire issue feels like the realization of Thatcher's claim that there is no such thing as society. Is it possible to address these significant issues without serious changes to policing, political systems, economics, significant investments to educate people about the inherent unity of humanity? Is this on some fundamental level an issue that is fixable by government without some kind of normative policy to change society?
All I can say is we won't know unless we try. You know, I mean, it is a big issue. I think you've heard, you know, in this panel, how broad and deep and entrenched this issue is, and that there's not just one, we can't tweak this issue, right? We can't just tweak it and go, okay, now we're good to go. But I don't think that's bad. You know, I don't think we should be afraid. There's a lot of fear. We've already said that, but we shouldn't be afraid of having hard conversations about who we are as a society and how we can make sure that each one of us are safe is not a bad conversation to have. And so, yes, it sounds like, you know, oh, this is too big for us, but I don't think this is too big for us. This is what we do as a community, right? We sit down, we talk about what the issues are, and then we solution them. And I, you know, big, yes, changes, perhaps, big changes, yeah, maybe. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have these hard conversations.
Thank you, Lisa. I've got a question here for Chief Neufeld. Chief Neufeld, you recently signed a document that states the Calgary Police Service supports reallocating resources from our existing budget to work with community partners to develop alternative ways to respond to Calgarians in crisis. What percentage of your budget do you think should be reallocated? Am I correct that this reallocation will occur or at least start to occur during the 2020 budget process?
So definitely not in the 2020 budget process, because of course we're most of the way through 2020 now. What we'd been looking at was trying to look at potential solutions that would reduce some demand going into 2021. And so all of that's going to be wrapped up in the budget discussions that will occur probably in November, starting with the commission and then through to City Council. So that's a process that we're engaged in right now. And so I can tell you now, and I don't disagree with Lisa in relation to, we should be unafraid to try things, but I do think we need to be a little bit cautious about how we proceed in the sense that we do want to have an evidence base, and we do want to make sure that we're proceeding in a way that with solutions that work. And I think some of the panelists have referred to different programs that exist in other countries and that sort of thing. So that's really good to be looking at those for efficacy and whether or not those could be generalized and whether or not we could achieve similar solutions here in our country. But at the end of the day, I think about 86 or 87% of our budget is people. And certainly the city of Calgary has a big footprint. So the idea that we could have a large scale reallocation of budget dollars is in the short term, not something we would be advocating. And we have taken a number of scenarios to the Police Commission, certainly, along with what the impacts would be in this current environment. And then obviously that would go forward to City Council afterwards.
Thank you, Chief Neufeld. Thank you very much. Dave, maybe over to you. What's the practicality of merging between police officers and social workers? Is there any examples? An example being a team of social workers who attend crime scenes alongside officers. Any idea of the practicality there?
Well, I don't think, I wouldn't recommend merging the two professions because I think they have different mandates. One is provision of safety for citizens, and as social workers, we work to enhance or improve or maintain the quality of lives of citizens. But that doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be some interaction between police services and social workers. And in one of the areas that I've done some work is in the area of intimate partner violence. And I know, and I can't recall the jurisdiction, but I know in some jurisdictions, in responding to incidences of intimate partner violence, a social worker accompanied the police officer, and it was typically the social worker who took on the responsibility of trying to de-escalate the situation, the tension and drama. I also know that certain police forces do indeed in this country and the United States hire social workers. In fact, one of our former PhD students had worked for police services for years, and I have a good friend who got his master's in social work and then got a degree in sociology, and he's been working 15 years for the corporate as a corporate analyst in Ontario. So I think that there are areas of commonality where by having social workers and police officers work together to lessen the number of people who are shot and killed or seriously injured by the police services. But I don't see a formal merger.
Terrific. Okay, just time for one more question here. I work on a multidisciplinary team of police and RSWs, that's registered social workers, and have the benefit of supporting clients from both perspectives on the front line. Do you see this model expanding within the CPS? Regine, do you have a comment on that one, perhaps?
I think interdisciplinary work is not a bad thing, but I think whatever programs or systems are cooperating to really ensure the safety and the well-being of our communities is questioning our procedures and policies of how we address these issues. Because I think if the police, the social workers, the doctors have to also question how non-violent are the interventions that are being suggested. And when they meet up, if policies are being put in place, who is in and who may be left out, so that whoever at the practice level can be guided by non-violent policies and procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Regine. So that unfortunately brings us to the end of this fantastic discussion. Thank you to our panelists, Lisa Silver, Mark Neufeld, Regine Oibriejo-King, and David Est. Thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge with all of us today. We'd like to hear what you thought about today's program, so please provide your feedback in our short poll. Dawn's going to bring up the poll there, and just click on whichever one you would like to select. And as today's panel discussion showed us, UCalgary is a place that ignites curiosity, determination, and ingenuity. And a brief discussion like this can't, of course, begin to really explore these issues. There's so much more to learn. And as our panelists have all stressed, this wider societal discussion is just beginning. We'll hope that you'll continue to become educated on this issue in particular. In that note, our panelists have put together and will continue to add resources, including books, articles, links, other kinds of resources that you might find helpful. And you can find them on our Faculty of Social Work website, which is socialwork, all one word, ucalgary.ca/stop-racism. So we'll hope you'll also explore everything that Alumni Month has to offer at alumni.ucalgary.ca. A recording of today's session will also be posted to the Alumni Month website in the coming days. I'm wishing you a really good day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.